Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special program that is dedicated to showcase everything with regards to the national dialogue. Whenever we talk about the national dialogue, we don't talk a lot about the first initiative that came up with the idea of national dialogue. This initiative came up with 4 possible scenarios in order to see a better future in Ethiopia. And the founder and coordinator of Destiny's Ethiopia is here with a lot of explanation. Do stay with us. Nigussu Aklilu, founder and coordinator of Destiny Ethiopia Initiative, thank you for blessing us with your time.
The same here.
So whenever we talk about this national dialogue and everything related, you came up with the idea. Let's talk first about that of the inception, the inclusivity, and the purpose, as well as the progress of Destiny Ethiopia Initiative.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we didn't call it a national dialogue as such. It's a very different kind of approach. So what we did was, before even a national dialogue could be launched in a country, there are some precursors, some really preliminary activities that need to be conducted. So what we did was, personally, I took the liberty to look into other countries, how countries that faced the same situations that Ethiopia have been facing, how did they come out of that situation? For instance, when political perspectives are extremely polarized, when a unilateral set of measures cannot really bring a solution to the crisis, etc. And when it really requires some kind of collective action, collective conversation, what did other countries do? So it was kind of a coincidence. I was working for DFID, now UKAID, as the climate and environment advisor. So I was looking at different materials that were landing on our tables. So one material that I read was about foresight. So in that material, I came across a very amazing experience of how South Africa, Colombia, and a few other countries have adopted a certain methodology to kind of get out of this stuck kind of position. So the methodology that was used by different actors in these countries was called transformative scenario planning. And this methodology is very interesting because it was adopted from the corporate sector. The corporate sector, especially Shell company, has been using it for a long time as a business strategy, so that they would anticipate some uncertainties, some unforeseeable future circumstances, and kind of come up with some strategies to overcome such uncertainties. For instance, in the 1970s, it was only Shell companies that was able to see the oil crisis well before it happened. And they already had a strategy to overcome that. And by the end of the day, when all the oil companies got bust, Shell company came to the top. So around the 1990s, when South Africa was in a very deep kind of crisis, and the international pressure was mounting on the South African apartheid government, some people came across this initiative, and they invited some people, scenario planners from the Shell company, to conduct a political scenario planning process, a national scenario planning process. And they adopted it in such a way that it would transform the political circumstances in the country. By then, Nelson Mandela was released from jail, but the political crisis in the country was still not settled. So a couple of university professors approached Shell company and Shell company assigned one young person, a scenario analysis person, and that person then guided the two professors to adopt the corporate scenario planning process to be used to tackle the political crisis in South Africa. So what they did was simple but not easy. They kind of mobilized around 30 people from the entire political and economic spectrum of South Africa. Then they brought them into a process that took 3 workshops and several months. And by the end of the day, what they asked them to do was to build scenarios for South Africa, scenarios of possible futures for South Africa. So they came up with 4 scenarios. Then that was the beginning of how mutual understanding was being created among the different actors, because the political actors were actually suspecting one another. They have never worked together in the past. So this gives them an opportunity to really have a candid conversation on the social ills, the economic issues, and the political crisis. And then they, out of the 4 scenarios, they called the 3 scenarios bad prophecies, and 1 scenario was called the most desirable scenario. And the beauty of this scenario planning process is it helps you to collectively explore, collectively navigate, and collectively envision a desirable future. And that's what they exactly did. And then they also identified some pathways of how that better scenario, what that preferred scenario could be realized in South Africa. And this guy, his name, the guy who was assigned by Shell company, his name is Adam Kahan, and he then left Shell and he set up his own company, and he kind of made it a business to go around the world and to fix political circumstances in different parts of the world. And he went to Colombia and he did a fantastic work in Colombia. He went to Guatemala, Thailand, and several other countries. So I just read this and I was really inspired and encouraged. So I looked at the political situation in the country back then. It was 2018 when the new government was taking shape, and I then thought maybe this is the right time to do the scenario planning process in the country. By the way, I explored this methodology not in 2018 but around 2012. So it took me around
that was much long ago.
Yeah, to study, to deep dive into the process, and also to have a conversation with other colleagues, other friends and colleagues. So in 2018, we thought the time is ripe now to conduct such kind of a process, because the civil society proclamation back then, I mean before 2018, wouldn't allow you to engage in such kind of politically sensitive process. And personally, I'm not a politician. I have never been affiliated to any political party. I considered myself an environment and climate expert and also advocate. So what I did then was I consulted a few other colleagues who, one was a pharmacist, a few others were lawyers, some others were working for the UN system, African Union, etc. So
they were your friends?
Friends and friends of friends. We wanted to keep it a small group so that it would be manageable. Otherwise, it would just be a headache to manage this small group. And we also tried to make it a diverse group in terms of political perspectives. So one thing that we agreed was to sign a kind of code of conduct, and that code of conduct was very crucial to undertake the process, because according to that code of conduct, all of us were obliged to suspend our judgments and opinions about Ethiopia and about politics in the country. So that's what we did, and every one of us kind of sticked to this principle and a number of other principles. So the next step was then, how can we do it? The next thing we did was we consulted. I approached the person who conducted the South African process, that Canadian guy, Adam Khan, who used to work for Shell company. I contacted him via LinkedIn, and I just asked him, can you help us? He said, absolutely. Then we decided to meet, and we went to Europe. The three of us from Ethiopia went to Europe, and it was still a very secretive and confidential process. Then we met him in Europe, and we asked him some questions. Number one, do you think this process would help our country? Number two, would you be able to help us? So we also tried to explain the political complexity in the country, and also the diversity that we have here, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and how complicated politics is here in Ethiopia. So for this question, his response was very straightforward. He said, you know, wherever I go, what people tell me is, you know, our country is very complicated. So he said,
he knew about this.
Yeah, all countries are different, but all countries are the same also. So don't worry. To the second point, whether this methodology would be the right methodology to employ under the given political circumstances at that time, we had almost 2 days and 2 nights with him, and after a long discussion about everything that is happening in the country and that happened in the country, he said, maybe it would help. Let's give it a try.
Was there any similarity between South Africa and Ethiopia?
Yeah. So he said, let's go for it. Then we came back with 3 big questions. One, we have to convince the government. We have to have a political buy-in from the incumbent. And back then, Prime Minister Abiy's government was just coming to power, and we had to approach the new government in several ways. It took us several months to get to the right people, and finally we got political support for the process. Then the next step was to sell the idea to political parties and other influential people in the country, because the process requires bringing together people who are insightful and influential. You cannot just bring everyone to the table, but insightful and influential people who can also represent different political perspectives in the country. In addition to all the diversities that we have here, ethnic, religious, gender, age group, etc. So we tried to approach political parties in the beginning, and that was a very interesting process, because wherever we went, the first question that was coming to us, who are you? We are nobodies. We are just concerned citizens, professionals, accomplished professionals. But we believe that we can conduct this process so that we can bring at least, if not all or many people, but at least tens of influential and insightful people into a room and kind of guide them into a collective process. So after a painstaking process, we tried to garner a good political support from almost all political parties that we approached. Back then, the political landscape was not as complicated as it is now. We had very limited number of political parties back then. So the EPRDF was represented by all the member parties, and the other significant number of opposition parties were represented. But the other beauty of the process was we decided intentionally to mix the participation between politicians and people from non-political professions or spheres. So we approached prominent media people, we approached prominent academia, and also some people from the diaspora community, from the civil society, the private sector. And while doing this, we also tried to ensure that the composition of the people would be fairly representative of the diversity that we have in Ethiopia.
What about the partnership? Because you are telling me a lot of resource in the discussion. I'm seeing a lot of resource, a lot of time, a lot of things involved. Who is helping you in this regard?
Yeah, so that came a little later, because in the first place we really wanted to make sure that the process can happen and we have the right political support to conduct it, to conduct the process. Otherwise, it would be just bringing the cart before the horse. So we decided intentionally to, first of all, cement the political support from our local actors, and after we gained the confidence that we can do it and we have substantive political support from Ethiopian colleagues, then we tried to approach different embassies, and 3 embassies agreed to support us. So the Irish embassy back then, and the Danish embassy and the Royal Netherlands embassy agreed to pool resources to help us, and Forum of Federations, which is an intergovernmental organization which in which Ethiopia is also a part, agreed to host this initiative because it was just an initiative. So we tried to mobilize resources. It's a long story, but we also had a very long conversation with the Ministry of Peace, which had the legal mandate to kind of oversee such kinds of activities. So we had a very fruitful discussion with Her Excellency Minister Muferiat and her colleagues back then, and we had a full backing of the Ministry of Peace and also all, I mean, the government machinery in general, and also opposition politicians. So that's how the process started, and basically what happened was we had 3 residential closed workshops, not open to the public, and as a rule we kind of agreed with our scenario team members, around 50 of them, that this is not going to be disseminated to the public until we reach our conclusion. And I mean, even activists who participated, I mean very prominent activists who participated in our process, restrained themselves from social media publicity, which was really very prideful kind of element in the process. So it was not reported, it was not even seen in any kind of...
No, I've never seen this. No. I've never seen this. I heard about you guys only from the Addis Work explanation and everything that came up before, because there needs to be some group who could come up with these 4 possible scenarios before bringing it to the Prime Minister's office, and you guys were the one.
Yeah, but I mean, in the first place, we didn't go to the Prime Minister's office. Once we got the political support from the government, we didn't see a need to approach the office of His Excellency, because we have what we needed. So we invited all these participants into the process, and after 3 consecutive or 4 consecutive workshops that took place in a span of around 7-8 months outside Addis, and well secured workshops, then we finally came up with the 4 scenarios. And what's very interesting is at the end of the process, one of the most difficult parts of the process was naming the scenarios. And
because it involves a lot of issues, and it involves a lot of stories. It's like an anecdote that needs to come up with a title, right?
It was like, you know, giving birth to a child, and, you know, family members arguing about what should be the name of the new child. And honestly, this kind of argument, when, I mean, in a family, is very normal because it emanates from a sense of ownership. So that's exactly what we observed in the process. So by the end of the day, they agreed on the content, they agreed on the report, and the report was ready, but then we couldn't agree on the names because they were arguing very severely about the names. Then we were very happy, because when you argue about names, it's all about ownership. So for each scenario, for all the 4 scenarios, we had at least 7 candidates. And we decided to set up a special committee that would look into this. And after concluding the 4 workshops, one of which was an orientation workshop, we conducted another closed meeting in Addis, bringing these committee members to agree on the names. And we had to design another process to help them reach a decision. So
it was a tough one, but it was well deserved.
Yeah, it was. They took it very seriously, very personally. So when some people eventually saw that their candidate was picked, they were elated, and some people were disappointed that their names, their proposals were not accepted. So that was a very positive message. And all along, the report was, in our opinion, a byproduct of the process. It's like a molasses in a sugar factory. So the sugar of the factory was actually the relationships improving among the participants, mutual understanding kind of improving, mutual trust kind of being created among the team members, and also the willingness to work together. So these were really the most important elements of the process, apart from the report. So talking about the report is about scenarios of possible futures, 2040 Ethiopia, which is around 20 years from now. So we still have 2 decades to go.
A lot to do and a lot to engage. Yeah. This is different. The 7 driving factors and the 4 possible scenarios that brought the idea of a new dawn. Yeah. And one of the factors in that new dawn is the national dialogue, the idea of a national dialogue, which is big and which is up and running now in the new government.
Yeah. So before talking about the national dialogue, as a matter of process, when you do scenario building, the first thing you have to do is to identify key uncertainties. Key certainties and key uncertainties. Certainties are things that will definitely happen, whether you like it or not. And the uncertainties are things that you are not sure of, things that you are not certain about how they are going to unfold. So these are, when you build scenarios, it is the key uncertainties that are going to shape the futures of the country. So,
are they related to the driving factors?
Yeah, basically these are the driving forces. So social, economic, and political driving forces. So they identified there was a gravitation towards political factors like, conflict and violence. How would conflict and violence going to be in the time to come? And what would be the nature of democracy in the country in the next years to come? And not only that, shall we continue as a nation, as Ethiopia? It's all about national integrity. And apart from that, they also identified, because although there was a gravitation and kind of a propensity of participants to be pulled into political factors, the fact that we had civil society actors, private sector actors, academia, media professionals was very helpful in defining these key uncertainties. So, for instance, they came up with a very different set of uncertainties, like food security. Is Ethiopia going to be food secure in the next years to come? How is the economy going to look like? Are we going to have economic development, and is this economic development going to be inclusive? Not only that, we also talked about environmental degradation and climate change. They brought this idea of how climate change in the country and this environmental degradation that has happened in the country forever might really shape the future of the country. But equally importantly, they also picked one important element, which was global forces. Yeah, for instance, now we are witnessing COVID, we are witnessing the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and a number of other factors which are not directly coming from Ethiopia, but having a huge impact on the economy and our future as a nation. So these were the 7 key uncertainties that they identified. So the 4 scenarios were developed in terms of how we as Ethiopians, not just the government, but we as Ethiopian people, we as Ethiopian institutions, we as Ethiopian government as well, are going to respond to these circumstances, these social, economic and political uncertainties. How are we going to respond to them? So if we are going to respond to them in an authoritative kind of manner, then the scenarios that we are going to face might be hegemony. If our approach and our response is kind of divided and protective, then that scenario would be divided house scenario. And if the response is going to be extremely cautious and also capacity constrained, then that would lead to what we called, or what the scenario team members called, a broken chair scenario. And if we as Ethiopians commit to ensure a steady building of institutions, if we give institutional response to this crisis, then Ethiopia will have the dawn scenario. This is how they kind of came up with the 4 scenarios.
Amazingly, hegemony was one of the factors that has happened in Ethiopian history for a long period of time, throughout the kingdom, throughout the period of Derg, call it TPLF and everything. How did this happen? How was the scenario about? Tell us about it.
Honestly speaking, we had, for instance, a session where scenario team members listened to different perspectives of Ethiopian history and also Ethiopian economy, governance in the past, So, and this helped them really to come to kind of not the same page, but kind of similar page. So these 4 scenarios were not something that are new to Ethiopia. We had glimpses of dawn in Ethiopia's past. We had a divided house scenario, like in the era of the princes, Zaman al-Masafint. And we had an era of a broken chair. I mean, all along Ethiopian history. So it was not something new. But the commitment from the group was, we can bring the dawn scenario into realization if we can really continue to engage collectively, to build institutions, etc. So this is how they came up with the 4 scenarios.
Amazingly enough, in one of your writings on report, I've read that there was this event, an initiative that you created in order to engage Ethiopian historians to come up to terms, in order to have an understanding about the history of Ethiopia, which was diminished, which was not given due attention back in the days. What was the finding about, tell us?
That was a joint initiative by the Ministry of Peace and the MIND Consortium, the multi-stakeholder initiative for national dialogue. And what we tried to do is we tried to bring historians from all over the place, most universities in the country, and we identified 2 problems, 2 issues. One is historians do not have a professional association. And professional association of historians is not just about getting organized. It's also about setting a standard about how history should be written and told in the country. So we are living in an era where people are writing history or story from their own perspectives. And if we had the Association of Ethiopian Historians, they would have informed the public that this is credible, this is not credible, you know, some sort of quality standardization would have come from that history association. So Association of Ethiopian Historians was established during the emperor's regime, but during the Derg regime it was demolished, and they never had an Association of Ethiopian Historians. So we thought, after some preliminary conversation with some key historians in the country who took the initiative with us to organize this workshop, we thought that, okay, that could be one area where we could focus on. The second was kind of a deplorable situation where I don't know if whether Ethiopians know about this, but history as a common course, a freshman common course, is not being given since early 90s in the country. And anyone who has joined Ethiopian universities as of the 1990s, early 1990s, we are not taking history courses, and that's a shame. And that was another kind of motivation for us to bring the historians together. And of course, apart from that, history is the epicenter of Ethiopian politics. It has always been the epicenter of Ethiopian politics. All political earthquakes have their roots in how history has been written and history has been told by different political actors. And like many other professions and many other institutions, this institution has also been politically instrumentalized. So we brought historians together. They stayed 4 days in a room, and what we did was, there were already some efforts by historians in Addis and several other places, especially Bahar Dar, to set up this new association and also relaunch the history common course. But what we did with that conversation was, we tried to give it a finishing touch. And we had two outcomes from that discussion. In the first place, they agreed that they should set up their professional association, which they did after a few months. Now it's a registered association, which is quite a remarkable achievement. And just last week or the week before, they had their 1 year anniversary, the first year anniversary, and I was there to witness the conversations there. And on the second issue of the History Common Course, it's incredible. The contentious article which has divided historians for more than 2 decades and which has proscribed the Ministry of Education and universities from delivering this course was just one article in the textbook. They have already gone a lot of miles and they have zoomed in to this one article and they couldn't settle it. And after some conversations, they agreed to kind of come up with a consensual modification, amendment of that article. And they agreed to relaunch the History Common Course in universities. And that conversation is still happening with the Ministry of Education now. There are still some political hurdles to be overcome, but for sure at least 10 universities are now currently delivering this course for freshman students, which is a huge achievement. And hopefully in the next year or the following few years, our students and our children will be able to learn this History Common Course. And to me, it's very intriguing how historians, as credible and also very respected professionals, were not able to agree on one article which had a far-fetched impact on the nation in general. So now they have agreed. And the good thing is historians representing different kinds of perspectives have come to terms now. So it's only a matter of operationalizing it, and hopefully they will be able to deliver it. So the lesson from that conversation is, if historians can agree, why not us?
That's a perfect and amazing, something that we need to recognize in this institution, in this initiative, because what you did is amazing. What you did is something that needs to be recognized. But whenever we talk about the scenarios, besides the 4 scenarios, there's this down scenario that you are engaged in right now. Tell us about it.
So the down scenario, normally from our international experience, countries which have conducted scenario planning processes, what we know is it was not compulsory to pick one scenario as a desirable scenario. But in our process, what was really amazing is when we had this conversation on how to launch the scenarios. So the scenario team members came up with a question, and that was shared with the larger group. And the question was, why don't we pick the more desirable scenario? What prevents us from doing that? Then we said, that's up to you, as you wish. So they convinced each other, and eventually they agreed to make the dawn scenario as the most desirable scenario. Then if the dawn scenario is the most desirable scenario, then the next thing they did was when the scenarios were launched in December 2019, they also had a very interesting conversation about pathways, how the dawn scenario could be realized. And that was very interesting. So they identified at least 3 key pathways that would lead us to the dawn scenario. So one was the steady building of institutions. So when we talk about institutions, we are talking about democratic institutions and other institutions in the country. So basically what that means is institutionalizing our politics, institutionalizing our social and economic stuff. So that would create some sort of institutional memory and also accountability. Accountability that is key for the realization of the dawn scenario. The second important thing that they identified is they also felt that national reconciliation needs to happen. And when we talk about our history, our past history, it is full of resentment, anger, suspicion. That has also shaped our political culture during the last, many decades. So nobody could come up with a single epoch in Ethiopians' past history where some entities stood up courageously and kind of apologized. No. So
it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, so they agreed that a national reconciliation needs to happen. And the Ethiopian Reconciliation Commission was then set up, which is really good.
Involved in the national
Yeah. Yeah. So the third important pathway that they identified is there was a lot of discussion about political culture in the country. How did we as Ethiopians resolve, quote unquote, resolve our differences, our contradictions in the past? And most of the means that we employed was violent means. Sometimes it was a coup d'etat, sometimes it was people killing one another, sometimes it is bloodshed in the form of war, civil war. So somehow all our past, the political crises were kind of halted violently, not in a non-violent way. So the scenario team members said, why don't we start roundtable discussions? Why don't we opt for non-violent means of addressing our differences and conflicts? So the idea of this national roundtable dialogue, national dialogue, was born from this process. So we picked it from there. And the Ministry of Peace was very inspired by that. And we set up a team of 3 institutions: the Ministry of Peace, the Ethiopian Political Parties Joint Council, and Destiny Ethiopia. Then we created what we called the MIND, what we later called the MIND Consortium. And the whole idea was to launch national dialogue in the country. So that was how the whole discussion about national dialogue started. And the MIND Consortium, at a later stage, we, the 3 founders, agreed that we have to identify some other initiatives already going on in the country so that we are not going to duplicate efforts. So we identified several initiatives, and five organizations decided to join us. So one of them was the Ethiopian Reconciliation Commission, and the others were, for instance, Yahasab Ma'ad, the Ethiopians for Inclusive Dialogue, Justice for All, and Initiative for Peace. So all these are local initiatives, by the way. And we became 8 organizations, and we have been working on preliminary foundation for the national dialogue process, kind of learning from international experiences, and also lobbying, advocating, consulting with a number of actors in the country, just to get a political buy-in for the process. So we were able to talk to, plenty, numerous actors in the country, private sector, civil society, media, whatever. And we also had consultations, specialized consultations with some groups, like with the historians, with the media, with the youth, with women's groups, etc. So that's how we had a one-on-one conversation with all these groups and also different institutions until government then decided to give it an institutional arrangement in the form of a National Dialogue Commission, and then we changed our roles since then.
And the way it was presented through chronological order in order to come up with such a big initiative that could change the history of Ethiopia is really great. And one thing I like to recognize this in Ethiopia and Mind Ethiopia is the pre-election dialogue that you had, which is great in its initiatives because it created a sense of consensus in order to work for Ethiopia. Whether they were beaten in the election or not, this was one of the things. Even after the election, there was a certain dinner where there was a recognition for the activities that you had, for the efforts that you can give to Ethiopia. So with that being said, I'd like to talk about the national dialogue because it's one of the scenarios that could bring the dawn, a new dawn in Ethiopia. And with the issue of the national dialogue, I know it's an amazing project. I know it can be perfectly done if we are up to it with all the heart and soul that we can give to it. At the same time, there are these challenges through the conflicts with the preparation of TPLF to wage a war against South Ethiopia, with Onek Shene coming and distracting this big initiative. How can we use this to the best interest of Ethiopia, to the interest that we have of uniting Ethiopia, to the interest that we have of bringing justice in Ethiopia?
I think it would be worthwhile to say a few words about the pre-election dialogue, because that's one of the things that gives all of us confidence and courage to move on and to really keep faith in us as Ethiopians. So in February 2020, we had this initial conversation with political parties that were registered back then. And the question we asked them was, do you think a national dialogue would be necessary for Ethiopia? Then they said yes. And the next question was, how would you want to move forward? So since election was coming up, then they suggested a couple of things. One is we have to divide it into two phases. One should be the pre-election phase, and the next one is the post-election phase. So for the pre-election phase, we have a number of issues. So we really need to have a conversation on that. So then we took the courage to bring political actors together who were running for election, and some parties also who were not running for the election. So we had 3 consecutive closed meetings. And the 3 consecutive collective meetings were bringing together all political parties into a room for 2 to 3 days. And the issue was political parties were coming up with a number of concerns and complaints from the ground, from the regions, from the zones up to the federal government. So most of the criticisms and the concerns were leveled at, for instance, the security apparatus, for instance, sometimes on the election board itself, and sometimes on the ruling party. So we agreed to bring all these actors where criticisms were leveled at, and in the 3 consecutive workshops that we have had, we invited the National Election Board members, the Minister of Peace herself, representing all the security institutions in the country, police and other intelligence, and also the ruling party itself. The ruling party, we invited one person from each region, one senior person from each region, so that they would respond to the concerns from the political parties running in regional and federal elections. So every time we met, what we did was, okay, we kind of do a stock taking exercise. What did we discuss last time? What were the major concerns? Are these addressed or not? So then we also had what we call emergency clinics. So these emergency clinics were hypothetical clinics where these people from the three institutions, election board, the security, and also the ruling party, were sitting in separate rooms and kind of talking to the different political parties about concrete criticisms from the ground. And these emergency clinics were trying to address the issues on the spot. Yeah, sometimes they just give a call to someone and kind of convey a message. Sometimes they kind of take an appointment, and sometimes they do referrals to other institutions, like any physician would do in a clinic. So that was very instrumental. So by the end of the day, after we did the last closed workshop, the issues, there were still some issues not resolved. Some issues were really resolved. Other issues were not resolved. So the opinion was divided among political parties, whether the election would be fair, democratic, peaceful, etc. So, but what's beautiful is, if not fair enough, if not democratic enough, we can commit to make the election a peaceful one. And that is a collective commitment of the political parties as a result of this collective engagement that we have had. And finally, we had a dinner party, a pre-election dinner party, the first of its kind in the country. And the Prime Minister was there representing his party, along with some of his colleagues, and senior party leaders from 45 political parties, represented by at most 3 people were in the place. And we prepared a card, a good wish card, and they were exchanging the cards, and that gave kind of a very good full stop to the pre-election campaign. And what they agreed to make the election a peaceful process was, if there are going to be any issues, they are not going to take it to the streets, but they are going to take it to the court and the National Election Board. And that's exactly what they did. And I think this collective engagement and the commitment of the political parties that to make the election a peaceful process is something that the political parties need to be appreciated for. Really, we didn't appreciate the political parties enough, in my opinion, for that.
And that was kudos to the initiatives that was taken back then, back to the issues of the national dialogue, conducting it in such a challenging time.
Yeah, so regarding the current circumstances, this was one of the questions that was lingering and coming up again and again in our preliminary preparation as Mind Consortium. So one thing we did was, okay, national dialogue is going to happen in Ethiopia for the first time. We don't have any experience in that regard. But what was the political context in other countries? So interestingly enough, in many countries, of course, the political context was kind of secure, safe and secure, no conflict. But in several other countries, the national dialogues happened, yeah, in the midst of national crisis, conflict, violence, etc. So we also drew from the experiences of countries like South Sudan and also, all these countries, Yemen, for instance. So what we can do is, all these warring parties, the national dialogue is going to be inclusive. So the national dialogue is, in my opinion, going to kind of encourage all these warring parties to come to a round table. And what we have seen from the past is any kind of violent approach or violent means has never come up with a durable solution for our problems. So if we really want to resolve our conflicts durably and sustainably, a roundtable discussion, national dialogue is the only options that we have at hand.
And that is truly one of the things. But on the other side, there's this challenge that could come throughout the history of the political history of Ethiopia. Our parties will always say, my way or the highway. And cooperation is one of the biggest tasks that we need to accomplish, that we need to go on, so that we can see a better future, a new dawn for Ethiopia. What's your take on this?
We have never had a candid conversation nationally on our political issues, and in my humble opinion, and also drawing on experiences in other countries that have gone through similar and sometimes even worse experiences, our conflicts can be resolved in a non-violent way. And there is this tendency, as a result of a hangover from the past, that we have to somehow dominate, some elements really want to dominate, which would eventually or automatically make other parties submit to the process. So any scenario of one party dominating and other actors kind of submitting to the process wouldn't bring us a lasting solution to the country. So in my opinion, the only thing that we never tried in the past is dialogue. And we have to give dialogue a chance. And we have, at least from our recent past, from the experiences that we have had as Destiny Ethiopia Mind, we have some evidences that by coming into a room, then people can come up with collective solutions together. And honestly speaking, some of our solutions are not easy, but what the opportunities that national dialogue or such kinds of conversations would give us is listening to one another. And one major downside, although we as Ethiopians have a lot of things to be proud of, one thing that we should be ashamed of is we have never been good listeners. We have never been good listeners to the other parties. So, I mean, as a result of the ideology, the political ideology that successive governments have kind of adopted, like, you know, the imperial ideology and then the socialist ideology, which by somehow kind of encourage dictatorship and domination.
The hegemony.
Yeah, the hegemony kind of approach. We didn't have a chance to really have a candid national dialogue. And if, for instance, 1974, when the political parties, for the first time in the history of Ethiopia, political parties started to boom, some of the political parties were, for instance, advocating for democracy in the government, democracy in the country. and some were saying democracy should never be restricted. But internally, the intra-party dynamics, the inter-party dynamics was not kind of witnessing any kind of democratic ideals at all. So democracy is not something that you kind of prescribe to another actor. Democracy is something that we as political parties and institutions should adopt to resolve our differences internally. And democracy should also be a kind of approach that we need to adopt to resolve our differences with other political parties. I mean, once we assume a government, then that is a different story. But all these kinds of roundtable discussions, political culture, non-violent political culture, should start from our own intra and inter-party dynamics and institutional dynamics. And in my opinion, I think there is already some seed that is sown that we can harvest in the future, but we have to be intentional about it. We have to really commit to make the future a non-violent future. I mean, whatever the nature of the issue, whatever the magnitude of the topics that we are talking about, I think there is nothing that cannot be resolved. Maybe as a result of time and resource constraints, we will need to prioritize. We have to give some strategic priority for some issues. But in a way, I think by prioritizing our issues and by addressing some issues first and then the other issues next, we can definitely come up to some kind of formula which would help us to live together as Ethiopians.
Amazing. That's so powerful, by the way. But whenever we talk about, again, the national dialogue and its outcomes, that could be directly involved in the outcomes, as it has already started its activities, its preliminary activities to be exact. So what would be the tangible and intangible outcomes of the national dialogue?
Yeah, definitely the tangible outcomes are kind of clear. We have to have some formula for mutual coexistence. How can we coexist as Ethiopians, as diverse ethnicities, as diverse religions, as diverse diversities? How can we coexist? How can we coexist mutually with mutual respect, mutual benefit, etc.? This is something that can come up through some kind of policy revision, constitution revision, or whatever kind of political decisions that we are going to make through the process. So that we don't know what the national dialogue participants are going to suggest in that regard. But I think, in my opinion, the most important outcome is the intangible outcomes. It would help us navigate the political situation like we never did it in the past. For instance, by bringing Ethiopians together through, such kinds of processes to a round table, then it would help us to, for instance, forge relationships, improve our relationships as kind of divided people, politically, for instance. It can also improve our mutual understanding by listening to one another, because if we don't listen to one another, what we always do is we just judge. I judge you, you judge me. And judging others cannot bring any solution. At least, 90% of our differences can be resolved by listening, just by listening, lending our ears to the other party. And people feel very content and also kind of comfortable, convenient when they are listened to. This is deep inside our human nature. And apart from that, mutual trust. Trust is a currency that we have lost in the last many decades, centuries as Ethiopians. So mutual trust is something that would come out of this process. And eventually, the ability to work together. How can we, as Ethiopians representing different political perspectives, different historical perspectives, etc., how can we work together? So, collective action. So these are what in my opinion, the most important outcomes. So this is a platform that we need. Because national dialogue, of course, this is a national dialogue that is happening for the first time in the country. But once we make it part of our culture, then we can have dialogues, successive dialogues in the years to come. And this is something that we can really pass as a wonderful legacy from this generation to the next generation, so that the next generation cannot opt for the violent means and ways, but the non-violent roundtable discussions.
Amazing and powerful, because we need that now more than ever. It's high time also to recognize the majority of the population, the youth. Whenever we talk about the inclusivity, I think I've seen with the media engagement, I've seen 1 or 2 commissioners with young perspectives and young looks. And the majority, which is more than 60% of Ethiopia, is the youth. And how should it be? How should we involve the youth, as they are the ones who could take care of the future for Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think the youth, the youth is a segment in the population that has been targeted by political actors forever in the country and also in other countries. And the youth has always been the dominant segment in the population. So I think we need to have some proactive measures from the youth themselves. So since this group is highly targeted by politicians, the youth associations that have political affiliations and youth associations that have no political affiliations somehow should come together and kind of come up with some proactive measure to make sure that the national dialogue would be inclusive enough. I mean, in terms of representing youth in the discussions and also representing youth voices, youth agenda in the process. So this is something that the youth themselves should somehow take as their own agenda. It's not easy, but I think what it takes is, for instance, women groups, for your information, have now come together and formed a coalition to engage with the National Dialogue Commission, and they are already kind of advocating some ideas about women participation in the national dialogue and women's issues in the national dialogue, which is very interesting. Yeah, so the initiatives should be taken by the youth. The youth should come together regardless of their political perspectives, ethnic identities, etc. And somehow they have to make themselves visible. Of course, this would require some sort of political support as well. And I hope the National Dialogue Commission has already taken this as a serious issue, and they will definitely engage with the youth in a special way due to the special nature of the youth. But I don't think any segment of the population, including the youth, should wait until some other institution would give them, the chance, the chance to engage, whatever. We have to be proactive enough somehow. And I think it's possible to have youth voices in the national dialogue. What I know is there is a willingness and a readiness from the National Dialogue Commission to kind of be inclusive enough in terms of the diversities that we have in the country, including age groups.
Amazing. So whenever we talk about, again, NGOs, initiatives just like yours, and the international actors, what should be the role of these groups in order to enrich, in order to help a fruitful Ethiopia, a national dialogue as we expect it to be?
This is a very good example that the initiatives that we took as a civil society initiative or as an NGO, we can play very constructively, and we can kind of claim our space in such a way that we can push some agenda, like we did in the Destiny Ethiopia process. Again, the civil society sector can also be very easily politically instrumentalized. So at least what we could do is the civil society organizations can be good voices for the grassroots, because civil society organizations are working with grassroots communities in all over the country, and probably they are one of the good channels of communicating grassroots opinions, grassroots concerns to any such national process. So this is an excellent opportunity for civil society organizations, and they can come together intentionally to kind of package such concerns and such issues from the grassroots and kind of convey it to the national process. The second is sensitization. I think one major gap that we have at the moment is Ethiopians are not on the same page when it comes to having equal understanding about the concept of national dialogue and how it is running, how it is going to be operationalized, etc. So one major activity that they can do in tandem with, for instance, media outlets is sensitizing the public and kind of allowing a byway or a dual traffic of information communication between the national process and the grassroots processes. So messages from the grassroots reaching the national process, and anything happening here nationally or federally could also pass to the grassroots, the communities, so that they would be on the same page.
Amazing. Again, without the media, this idea of national dialogue would not be brought to the public. What should be the role of the media in order to bring about this national dialogue? Because this is the day of hoax news. Fake news can give a negative image to any society that we can think of.
When we talk about the media, we are talking about both the mainstream media, print, electronic, and also the internet-based media, which is now gaining pretty much prominence. So, in my opinion, the media will have probably the most important role in terms of making or breaking this national dialogue. The way we communicate information, the way we package information is going to be very critical in terms of influencing the process positively or negatively. So in a way, one major understanding that I really, this is my personal opinion, I really want to underline that the media in general should take is, this is the first of its kind in Ethiopia. And we have to give national dialogue a chance. So apart from sensitizing the public on the concepts of national dialogue and, you know, how kind of conveying perspectives of different professionals, I think another major role in this process is to really be careful in terms of how national dialogue should be reported to the public. for instance, when elections are happening, there are media kind of reporting on elections, and this is a special kind of skill or a special kind of expertise, election reporting. So national dialogue does also require same kind of degree of caution and sensitivity. So national dialogue reporting should be well informed politically, economically and socially, and it has to be very carefully conducted. Otherwise it can easily kind of damage a process that is happening for the first time in the country. So this is one thing. On the other hand, it's also, I think, the role of the media to kind of, convey public opinion, concerns, criticisms to the National Dialogue Commission. There is no other actor better placed than the media to do this, to kind of channel information from the public to the National Dialogue Commission. So I think the quality of reporting and somehow this is something that the media should be taking very cautiously and very professionally.
Awesome. Before we go, if there is any final remark, any unsaid idea, now is your time.
No, just to restate one thing that I just said earlier, probably a number of times, let's give dialogue a chance. That's it.
Awesome. Nigussu Aklilu, founder and coordinator of Destiny Ethiopia Initiative, thank you for blessing us with your time.
Yeah, thank you also for inviting me. Yeah.
Dear viewers, that's all that we've got for you inside this special edition that focused on everything national dialogue and the initiatives taken by Destiny Ethiopia. Thank you for staying with us, and do stay tuned for more from ETV English.